My phone buzzed against the nightstand at 2 in the morning, and my ex-mother-in-law's name lit up the screen for the first time in 2 years. I almost let it ring out. Then I heard her voice, and she said the words I never expected from her. But no one imagined what would come next. My phone buzzed against the nightstand at 2 in the morning, dragging me out of a half-sleep I hadn't earned. I almost let it ring out. Nobody calls at that hour with good news, until I saw the name on the screen. Patricia Hale, my ex-mother-in-law. A name I hadn't seen light up my phone in 2 years. I answered on the fourth ring, my voice rough. "Patricia, is everything okay?" "You won't regret this, Michael," she said before I'd even finished the question. Her voice was low, urgent, like she'd rehearsed the line on the drive to wherever she was calling from. "Not this time. I need to see you in person. Tomorrow, if you can." "I can't say this over the phone." "Say what?" "Tomorrow," she said again, and hung up before I could push further. I lay awake a long time after that, running through every version of what a 2 in the morning call from Jessica's mother could mean. None of them made sense. By 3, I gave up on sleep entirely, pulled on yesterday's jeans, and drove across town to the house on Pearl Street where Jessica had grown up. The house I hadn't set foot in since the divorce. Patricia opened the door before I'd finished knocking, like she'd been standing on the other side of it waiting. She was still in the same cardigan from the phone call, a kettle already going somewhere behind her in the kitchen. "You came," she said, and something in her voice cracked open with relief she hadn't let herself expect. "You said tomorrow. It's still technically tonight." She almost laughed at that, a small startled sound, and stepped back to let me in. "My name is Michael Turner. I'm 32, and I've spent the last 9 years learning how to make broken things tell time again. That's what a watchmaker does. Really, not fix things, just convince them to keep moving forward." I hadn't expected to spend that particular Wednesday night sitting at my ex-mother-in-law's kitchen table until sunrise, but there I was, coat still damp, watching her hands wrap around a mug she wasn't drinking from. Most nights I closed the shop at 7, walked 4 blocks to a 1-bedroom apartment on Curtis Street, reheated whatever I'd made on Sunday, and read old repair manuals until I fell asleep in the chair. It wasn't a sad life. It was just a quiet one. I'd built it that way on purpose. Jessica and I had been married 4 years before it ended. She wanted a life that turned heads. I wanted a life that stayed quiet. That was the whole of it, really. No affair, no single fight anyone could point to, just 2 people standing in the same kitchen wanting completely different futures. We divorced 2 years ago, mostly amicably. The kind of ending where nobody has to raise their voice because everything worth arguing about had already been said in silence. Over years at dinner tables where the only sound was forks against plates. I hadn't seen Patricia since the divorce was finalized. She'd sent a card. I still had it in a drawer I didn't open often. The 2 a.m. call was the first time I'd heard her voice since. We sat at that kitchen table for a long time before she said anything that mattered. She talked around it. The weather, a student she used to teach who'd become a state senator, the leak in the roof she kept meaning to call someone about. I let her get there in her own time. 9 years of fixing watches teaches you that patience isn't wasted time. It's just time spent correctly. Somewhere past 4, she got up, disappeared into the hallway, and came back with a small velvet pouch, setting it on the table between us like she was diffusing something. "I need you to look at this," she said. "That's part of why I called." I opened the pouch. Inside was a pocket watch. Gold-cased. The crystal cracked in a thin diagonal line. The stem bent at an angle that told me someone had wound it too hard, too fast, not caring what it cost. I turned it over. Engraved inside the case back, worn nearly smooth from decades of thumbs, R.H. Robert Hale, Patricia's father. I knew the watch. I'd restored it once before 7 years ago, as an anniversary gift from Jessica to her mother. My one contribution to that gift being 3 weeks of late nights, getting the escapement to run true again. I remembered handing it back to Jessica in a box lined with cotton. Remembered how pleased I'd been with myself. Remembered a version of my life where handing things to Jessica felt like the whole point of my days. "It stopped running 6 months ago," Patricia said. "I dropped it. I've been carrying it around broken because I couldn't make myself take it to anyone else. There are other watchmakers in Denver. Patricia. Not ones who know what it means to me. She said it flatly, like a fact rather than a compliment, and something in the flatness of it kept me from arguing further. I told her I'd take it back to the shop, that I'd need a few days. She nodded, but she didn't get up, and neither did I, and the two of us sat there as the kitchen window went from black to the dull gray that comes before an October sunrise, talking about nothing important because neither of us wanted to be the one to say why I'd actually driven across town at 3 a.m. I didn't ask why she'd really called instead of waiting for a decent hour. Some part of me already understood that the watch wasn't really the reason. It was the excuse standing in front of the reason. The way excuses always do. She came back 3 days later to check on the progress, which wasn't how watch repair worked, and both of us knew it. The following week, she brought a coffee for herself and, without asking, one for me. Black, no sugar, exactly how I took it. I didn't know if she'd remembered that or asked someone, and I didn't know which unsettled me more. By the third week, the bell ringing near closing meant her more often than not. We fell into something that had no name yet, but had a shape. She'd sit with a book while I finished the day's last repair, and the silence between us felt like something being built rather than worn away. One evening she came in wearing her reading glasses, the left hinge held together with a twist of wire that had clearly been someone's temporary fix months ago and had just never been replaced. I noticed it the way I noticed everything mechanical, automatically before I could stop myself. "Give them here," I said. "They're fine. They're held together with a paperclip wire, Patricia." She took them off and handed them over without further argument, which surprised me more than I let on. It took me 10 minutes with the right tools to reset the hinge properly. When I handed them back, she put them on, looked around the shop as if seeing it sharper than she had in months, and laughed. A short, startled sound like she hadn't expected the world to come into focus so easily. "I've been wearing those broken for a year," she admitted. "Jessica offered twice to take me to get new ones. I kept saying I'd get to it. I didn't ask why she'd let me fix them instead that same night." Without hesitation, when she'd waved off her own daughter's offer twice. I noticed it, filed it away next to the coffee she'd remembered how I took, and didn't examine it too closely. The way you don't press on a bruise you're not ready to name yet. She told me about her father one evening, about how Robert Hale had been a rail conductor for 30 years, how he used to say a man could tell everything about someone by whether they were early or late, and how the watch had been the one thing he trusted to keep him honest. He wasn't a man who said much, she said, turning her coffee cup slowly on the counter. But he was never once late in his life. Not for anything that mattered. I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone. How the shop had been my grandfather's, how I'd taken it over at 23, how some nights I stayed past closing because the apartment felt louder than the shop despite having no one in it. "Jessica never understood that about you," Patricia said quietly. "That you needed the quiet. She thought it meant you didn't want anything. Did you understand it?" She looked at me for a second longer than the question required. I understood it better than I let myself admit. I didn't know what to do with that sentence, so I let it sit on the counter between us like the watch, waiting to be looked at properly later. The restoration took longer than it should have. I kept finding reasons. A gear that needed recutting, a spring that wasn't quite right, a crystal I wanted to source from a specific supplier instead of the one 2 days away. Patricia never questioned the delays. I think she understood them the same way I did, without either of us saying it out loud. Neither of us was in a hurry for the reason she kept coming back to disappear. It was late October, the maples along Larimer Street stripped down to bare branches, when I finally set the watch on the counter between us. Fully restored, the case polished, the crystal replaced, the second hand sweeping in a clean, unbroken circle. "It runs true now," I said. "Better than it did when I fixed it the first time." Patricia picked it up, turned it over to look at her father's initials, and didn't say anything for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet in a way she wasn't trying to hide. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago, Michael." Her voice had changed, lower, careful, like she was setting down something heavy and didn't trust her own hands with it. I've wanted to say it for years. And I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that it would ruin things, that... The bell above the door rang. A customer, stamping snow off his boots, calling out that he'd come back if I was closing. I told him to give me 5 minutes. When I turned back around, Patricia had closed her hand around the watch, and whatever she'd been about to say had folded itself back down into silence. "It can wait," she said, standing, pulling her coat tighter. "It's kept this long." She left before I could ask her to finish the sentence. Through the front window, I watched her cross Larimer Street, coat pulled tight against the wind. Streetlights catching the first hard frost on the parked cars. She didn't look back. I realized only then that she never had in 3 weeks of visits, and I couldn't decide if it meant she was certain of something or terrified of it. I locked the register, killed the lights, and stood in the dark shop longer than I needed to, running my thumb along the ring her coffee cup had left on the workbench. 9 years fixing things other people had given up on, and I couldn't remember the last time something in my own life had felt unfinished in a way I actually wanted to see through. I thought about calling Jessica just to ask whether her mother had been acting strange. I picked up my phone twice and put it down twice. There was no version of that question that wouldn't require an honesty I wasn't ready to offer yet. I stood there a long time afterward, aware of something shifting under the surface of my life I didn't yet have a name for, and aware, too, that whatever Patricia hadn't said was going to come out eventually, whether either of us was ready or not. There was a coffee mug in my sink that had been there so long I'd started rinsing around it instead of washing it away. Pale pink lipstick still ghosted on the rim, a print I recognized before I recognized I was looking for it. Patricia hadn't stayed over. She'd never once stayed over. But somewhere in the 6 weeks since that night on Pearl Street, her cardigan had ended up on the hook by my back door. Her reading glasses case had taken up permanent residence on my counter next to the register, and I'd started buying the tea she liked even though I'd never once made her a cup in my own apartment. I'm not a man who collects things by accident. Every object in my shop has a reason for being where it is. So when I stood there looking at that mug, I understood, with the same plain clarity I used to read a broken movement, that I'd let something take root without ever deciding to plant it. We'd settled into a rhythm neither of us named. Tuesday she brought dinner to the shop and we ate at the workbench, the smell of clock oil mixing with whatever she'd made. Fridays I drove to Pearl Street after closing, and we sat on her porch until the cold pushed us inside, and inside was somehow easier than the porch, and neither of us mentioned that. Her late husband's tools were still in the garage there, untouched in a decade. One Friday she asked me to look at his old table saw, said she didn't know why she was still paying to keep the garage heated for machines nobody used. I told her some things aren't about the machine. She didn't answer that. Didn't. Just handed me a beer and changed the subject to the weather, the way she did whenever a conversation got close enough to something she wasn't ready to say. She mentioned once, almost in passing, a story her book club had been talking about, some carpenter 2 states over in Ashford, Ohio, who'd rebuilt a nursery for a family that had lost a baby, and how the whole town still talked about it years later. People remember the ones who show up quiet and just do the work, she said, not looking at me when she said it. I didn't ask why she'd brought it up. I had a feeling I already knew. There was a night in early December I still turn over sometimes. Nothing happened. Nothing at all. But I noticed the way she'd started leaving her second glass of wine unfinished whenever the conversation drifted somewhere unspoken, like she was keeping herself sharp on purpose. I never asked her why. Some silences you learn to leave exactly where they are. I should have seen it building. I didn't, not fully, until Jessica showed up at the shop on a Tuesday afternoon, still in her work blazer, car keys clenched hard enough in her fist that her knuckles had gone white. "Mrs. Abernathy saw Mom's car outside your building 3 nights this week," she said. No hello, no warm-up. I told her she was mistaken. Was she mistaken, Michael? I set down the tool in my hand slowly, the way you do when you know the next few minutes are going to require both of them steady. Your mother and I have been spending time together, as friends, at 11 at night, in a bachelor's apartment as friends. Jessica's laugh had no humor in it. You know what people in this town do with information like that. I know what your mother's been through, and I know I've never once treated her with anything but respect. Respect. She repeated the word like it tasted wrong in her mouth. Do you have any idea how this looks? My mother, my ex-husband, my... Grant's family is already asking questions about my side of things before the wedding, and now I've got Mrs. Abernathy calling me at work to ask if it's true my mother's. She stopped herself, jaw tight, unable to finish it the way people can't always finish the sentence that scares them most. Jessica's eyes went glassy, and for a second the anger in her cracked open into something older, something that had nothing to do with me at all. Do you know she almost left my father the year he gave her that watch? I found out from my grandmother years later. She stayed for me and Danny. She spent her whole life staying for other people. Michael, and I don't know what it means that the one time she's finally doing something for herself, it's... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, the same way her mother had stopped hers a month earlier. It's what? I asked quietly. It's you, she said, and left before either of us could turn that sentence into something we could actually talk about. I closed the shop early that day, hands unsteady in a way I hadn't felt since I was an apprentice fumbling my first real repair. I drove straight to Pearl Street without calling first, something I'd never done, and found Patricia sitting alone on her porch in the cold without a coat, like she'd been waiting for exactly this to happen, and had simply run out of ways to prevent it. Jessica came to see you, she said. It wasn't a question. She told me about the watch, about what almost happened the year your father gave it to you. I sat down beside her, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, not quite. Why didn't you ever tell me that? Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, the same habit I'd watched her fall into a month before on this exact porch. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual careful control. Because the truth is bigger than the watch, Michael, and I've been a coward about saying it for longer than I want to admit. She turned to face me fully. I've watched you for years, long before the divorce. I used to sit at your table on Sunday and think that Jessica had married the kind of man most women spend their whole lives looking for and never find. Gentle, and steady, and handsome, in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, just in the way you carried yourself. Like you'd never once needed anyone to notice you to know your own worth. And I told myself that was a mother's foolish pride talking. It wasn't. My daughter had the best man she is ever going to have, and she let her own restlessness talk her out of seeing it, and I have spent 2 years watching you build a quiet, lonely life for yourself and thinking that the waste of it was the closest thing to a sin I've witnessed in my 60 years on this earth. I didn't say anything. I don't think there was anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than what she just handed me. I'm not telling you this because I expect anything back, she said. Quieter now, almost apologetic, like the honesty itself embarrassed her more than the feeling underneath it. I'm 54 years old and I buried a husband and I raised 2 children mostly alone in the years after. And I promised myself a long time ago I'd rather regret the things I said than the things I swallowed. The wind picked up. Neither of us moved to go inside. You don't have to say anything back tonight, she added. I've waited this long. We sat there until the cold became something neither of us could ignore anymore, and when I finally stood to leave, she caught my hand for just a second. Not a held hand, just a brief, just warm pressure there and then gone, and said the only other thing either of us managed that whole night. A person can spend a whole life being someone's second thought and call it patience. I'd rather be somebody's first choice, even late, than keep being anyone's comfortable habit. I drove home with that sentence sitting in my chest the entire way, turning it over the way I'd turn over a movement I didn't yet understand, looking for the part that would tell me how all the pieces fit. I didn't sleep much that night, and I didn't call her the next morning either. Not because I didn't want to, but because I genuinely didn't trust myself to say anything worth the weight of what she'd handed me. Instead, I went to the shop early, sat at the bench, and found myself picking up her father's watch again, even though there was nothing left to fix on it. Just turning it over in my hands, listening to the small, steady ticking, thinking about a man I'd never met who'd apparently taught his daughter that the right thing and the easy thing were rarely the same one. 2 days later, she came by the shop like nothing unusual had happened, set down a container of soup like she always did on Tuesdays, and neither of us mentioned Friday night at all. That, more than anything she'd said on the porch, told me how much courage it had cost her to say it in the first place, and how much she needed me to let the silence hold until I was ready to break it myself. I didn't break it, not for weeks. Some truths need to sit in a room a while before you're strong enough to pick them up. 3 months passed before either of us said another word about it out loud. I kept the shop running. Patricia kept coming by on Tuesdays, and we kept not naming what had shifted between us. Both of us circling the truth she'd finally spoken like it was a live wire. Neither of us wanted to be the one to grab first. Jessica didn't call. Her wedding to Grant moved forward on a timeline neither of us tracked out loud, though we both knew the date without either of us saying it. The way you know a storm is coming from the pressure in the air before a single cloud shows up. Patricia and I found a new rhythm in those months. Not quite what she'd asked for on the porch, not quite what we'd had before it either. We still ate dinner at the workbench on Tuesdays. We still sat on the porch on Fridays. But something had loosened between us, some permission neither of us had granted out loud. And I caught myself more than once watching the door for her car before I'd admit to myself I was doing it. And somewhere in that quiet, a letter arrived at my shop from a workshop 2 states over, an offer I'd turned down twice already, for reasons that had never fully made sense even to me. Sitting unopened on my counter next to Patricia's reading glasses, waiting for a decision I wasn't ready to make. 3 weeks after the letter arrived, I finally opened it. The offer was real. A master restoration workshop outside Portland needed a horologist to take over when the current one retired. Full ownership transfer within 2 years. The kind of opportunity that doesn't repeat itself twice in a career like mine. I read it standing at my own counter, in my own shop, on Larimer Street, and felt nothing like the excitement I should have felt. I ran my thumb over the letterhead the way I ran it over a stripped screw, testing for the give that would tell me which direction things were meant to turn. There wasn't any, just the plain, uncomfortable fact that 6 months ago, I would have said yes before finishing the second paragraph, and now I couldn't make myself say anything at all. I didn't tell Patricia about it. Not yet. Some decisions need to sit in a person before they're ready to be spoken out loud, and I wasn't sure yet which decision this one was going to turn into. I put the letter in the drawer under the register, the same drawer where I kept spare mainsprings and crystals I hadn't found a use for yet, and told myself I'd deal with it when the wedding was behind us. 2 months later, Jessica married Grant at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city. I wasn't invited, which was fair, and I didn't expect to be. Patricia went, sat in the second row, and told me afterward that Jessica had hugged her longer than usual at the reception. Whispered something in her ear that Patricia wouldn't repeat except to say, "She's not angry anymore. She's just scared for me." That's a different thing. Scared of what? Of watching her mother love someone the way I never let myself love her father toward the end. Patricia said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most true things. I don't blame her for that. I spent 30 years teaching children about history, without ever once being honest about my own. There was a strange detail from that night she mentioned only once, almost as an afterthought. Her own mother, Patricia's mother, had pulled her aside at some point during the reception and said, "You look the way I looked the year I almost left your father." Patricia never explained further, and I never asked. But the sentence stayed lodged in me the rest of that week like a splinter I couldn't quite locate. I didn't push further that night. We sat on her porch, the winter finally breaking into something that smelled like spring, and for the first time since October, I let myself reach over and take her hand without either of us treating it like an event. 1 year passed. I kept the shop. I kept turning the Portland offer over in my head every few months, a decision that refused to fully close itself, sitting in a drawer the way Patricia's card had sat in mine for 2 years after the divorce. Patricia and I had settled into something neither of us needed to name anymore. Dinners most nights, her books on my shelf, my toolbox permanently relocated to her garage where her husband's old table saw finally hummed back to life under my hands. She'd started coming into the shop on slow afternoons just to sit, the way she had that first winter. Except now she brought her own tea instead of waiting for me to remember hers, and I'd stopped pretending I wasn't listening for the bell every time it rang near 4 o'clock. Neither of us mentioned Portland. I think she knew about the letter, She noticed everything the way I noticed everything mechanical, but she never once asked, and I understood that as its own kind of gift. The not asking, the same patience she'd spent a lifetime practicing. It was on the 1-year anniversary of that first 2 a.m. phone call that I took her father's watch apart again, not because it needed repair, but because I did that once a year with pieces that mattered to me. A full cleaning, a check of every jewel and pivot, the kind of maintenance most owners never bother with and most watchmakers consider sacred. That's when I found it. Tucked beneath the movement in a compartment so shallow and so well fitted I'd missed it twice before in 7 years of working on that watch, was a photograph, folded small, and a scrap of paper gone soft and brown with age. The photograph showed a young woman I didn't recognize at first and until I saw the eyes, and understood I was looking at Patricia, no older than 22, standing beside a man who wasn't Robert Hale. I sat with it a long time before I moved. My hands, which had spent 9 years learning not to shake over delicate work, were not entirely steady. The note in handwriting I now recognized as Robert's. Read only. For P. Some things are worth the risk of saying, even late. Don't spend your whole life almost telling someone. R. I drove to Pearl Street with the watch still open in its case, the photograph resting on top of the movement like a second heart, my mind running through every version of what I was about to hand her. None of them adequate. Patricia went pale when she saw it. She held the photograph a long time before she spoke, her thumb moving slowly across the edge of it like she was checking whether it was real. His name was Daniel, she said finally. I was 22. My father liked him more than my mother ever did, which tells you something about my mother. I chose the safer man instead, and I never regretted your grandfather-in-law. I loved him, truly, for 30 years. But there was always a version of my life I wondered about. My father knew. He hid that note in the watch before he gave it to me as a wedding gift, and told me years later that he'd done it on purpose, so I'd only find it when I was finally ready to understand what it meant. Why now? Why did it take you this long to find it? Because I wasn't ready before now, she said, and looked at me with an honesty that had nothing careful left in it. I think some things wait for the right hands to open them. I thought about the letter sitting in my own drawer, the one I still hadn't answered, and understood finally what I'd been circling for a year without letting myself land on it. You won't regret this, I said, echoing the word she'd said to me on the phone that first night, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. That's what you told me. You were right, I don't. I said it slowly, the way you say a thing you want someone to actually hear, not just receive. She laughed, really laughed, the sound cracking something open in her face I hadn't seen before, and pulled me into the kitchen where the kettle was already going, the way it always was, the way I hoped it always would be. We sat at that same table where she'd first set the broken watch between us, 2 years earlier almost to the week, and for a long while, neither of us said anything at all, because for once there wasn't anything left unsaid between us that needed filling. I never answered the Portland letter, not that week, not that month. It's still sitting in the drawer as I tell you this, unopened for the second time, because some decisions aren't really about the job at all. They're about which life you're building, and I'm still building this one repaired watch and one quiet dinner at a time. In no particular hurry to know how the rest of it turns out. Here's what I've learned, watching broken things become whole again for 9 years of my life. People mistake speed for proof of feeling. They think if something is true, it should have been said immediately, obviously, without hesitation. But some of the truest things I've ever heard were said late, carefully, by people who'd spent years making sure they were saying them for the right reasons. Patricia waited because she loved carefully, not because she loved less. My own quiet, the thing Jessica once mistook for indifference, was never absence. It was just a different way of paying attention. And somewhere between a broken watch and a hidden note, I learned that the people worth staying for are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They're the ones who keep showing up long after showing up stops being easy. If there's someone in your life who's been quietly patient with you, a person who shows up steady instead of loud, who remembers how you take your coffee without ever asking twice, I hope you don't wait as long as we did to notice what that patience actually is. And if you know someone tonight who's been carrying a feeling they're too afraid to say out loud, send them this video. Sometimes the only thing standing between two people and the truth is somebody finally being brave enough to go first. Patricia keeps her father's watch on the kitchen table now. Not in a drawer, not in a pouch, just sitting there in plain sight where anyone visiting might ask about it. And she tells them the short version, the version about a rail conductor who valued punctuality above almost everything else. She doesn't tell most people about the note, or about Daniel, or about the 22-year-old woman who chose the safer road and spent the rest of her life wondering, quietly, without regret exactly, but without peace either. She's told me that story in full exactly once. I think that's enough. Some stories are meant to be carried by one other person, not broadcast to a room. I still open that shop every morning at 8, same as I have for 9 years. Some things haven't changed at all. But the bell rings differently now. I know most afternoons exactly whose hand is about to push that door open, and I've stopped pretending that isn't the best part of my day. Have you ever waited years to say something that scared you? Has someone in your life ever shown up quietly and changed everything, without ever raising their voice to do it? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I answer as many as I can. And if this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.